Good afternoon and welcome to Alex Talks, Hamilton's version of TED Talks. My name is Greg Hokamp. I'm class of 1982 and I'm chair of the Trustee Committee on Instruction. I'm pleased you're here in person and online to witness the extraordinary talents of Hamilton's faculty. Today you will have the opportunity to hear from 6 members of our faculty on topics ranging from music and film to democracy and dissent, to inflation, to nanotechnology, and reason and passion. We have also have the pleasure of welcoming Tony Wayne, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, who is teaching at Hamilton this fall as the Saul Linowitz Visiting Professor of Government. Each of our presenters will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes and then take questions. We have 2 scheduled talks simultaneously at 4:05, 4:35, and 5:05. Each of these talks will be archived on the Hamilton website, so if you cannot decide which one to attend, don't worry. The archived version of the talk you missed will soon be on Hamilton's website. So I want to extend my sincere gratitude to our speakers and to our audience for participating in what we expect to be an ongoing series. Now, it's now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Tony Wayne, who will talk with us about Mexico's new effort to build a wall to keep Donald Trump out. I'm sorry. I can't introduce it. No, the real topic is Ambassador Wayne will discuss building a partnership with Mexico. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, it's great to be here. I'm having fun at Hamilton College. It's nice to be teaching here this fall. As you know, Mexico has been a punching bag in the presidential campaign this year, and pretty unfairly, in a way that's really distorted the importance of this relationship that we have with our southern neighbor. Wrong way. I was coming up. Now we'll go this way. Okay. The relationship with Mexico touches the daily lives of more Americans than any other relationship that we have in the world. And it's true even more so for Mexico. We have 34 million U.S. citizens of Mexican heritage. We have this almost 2,000-mile-long border with a lot of people crossing it legally and with good intent every day. And we have a common environment that has been increasingly important as we're looking to deal with climate change. We've overcome a lot of history to get where we are now. In the 1980s, the 2 countries were called distant neighbors because they really did not get along very well. There's a lot of history. People have worked very hard at this. But even after NAFTA was signed, it took a long time to build a trusting relationship between the 2 governments. What we have done in recent years has moved from a situation of finger pointing to actually working to find solutions. And right now we have an unprecedented degree of cooperation and collaboration between the 2 governments. Just to give a sense of this relationship, there are 1 million border crossings a day legally across our common border. People driving trucks, doing their normal business, going shopping each way. There are also a bunch of visitors that go back and forth. Probably a lot of you have been to Cancun or Los Cabos or Puerto Vallarta. You can see the numbers here. 25 million U.S. citizens, 17 million Mexicans coming up here. And together, they spent about $30 billion in local communities on each side of the border. Trade. Almost $600 billion worth of trade between the 2 countries. That's a lot of trade. In fact, you can see how it's grown from $100 billion a year up to almost $600 billion since the beginning of NAFTA. That's also gone up 35% since 2010. That's a greater percentage of increase, that's twice the rate of our trade with the rest of the world and with other countries in the world. So that adds up to $1 million a minute. It's actually $1.13 million a minute. So in the time that I've been speaking here, $3 to $4 million worth of things have crossed the border between the 2 countries. That just gives you a sense of the intensity of what's going on between these 2 countries. Mexico is our 2nd largest client in the world. Canada's number 1, Mexico's number 2. It is our third largest trading partner. China gets to be number one when you include what it sells to us. But if you add Canada and Mexico together, they far outpace China as a trading partner. So our two neighbors are our biggest clients. We sell more to Mexico than we sell to the famous BRIC countries. In fact, quite a bit more. We sell twice as much as we sell to China, to Mexico. And this is not just the border states. Texas and California happen to be big participants in this, but this trade goes to Pennsylvania, it goes to Michigan, it goes to Illinois. It's all over the country. And it is a trade that creates a lot of jobs. There are up to 6 million jobs, between 5 and 6 million, that are created and supported by this trade. 57,000 U.S. companies, that's a lot of companies, participate in this trade. And Mexico happens to be one of the largest trading countries in the world. It has free trade agreements with more countries than anybody else in the world. We are its biggest partner by far, but its approach to the rest of the world is really quite open. And in the last 20 years, it's not only changed the nature of its trade with us, it's changed the nature of its whole economy and its openness to the rest of the world. This chart really explains, in large part, what is very special about our trade with Mexico. So please, I'm going to take a minute here, look at this carefully. The simple version of what this says is, for every dollar of finished manufacturing product that comes from Mexico, 40% of the value of that, 40 cents, is actually U.S. content. So, and then you can see the second one in the list is Canada, our other NAFTA trading partner. And then you get down and you look at China is 4%, the EU is 2%. It's a really big difference. This is a unique relationship. We build things across North America. We build them together. Things go back and forth several times across the borders. A Honda CR-V put together in Jalisco, Mexico, has a U.S. motor, a U.S. transmission, U.S.-made motor and U.S.-made transmission. 70% of the value of that Honda CR-V when it comes back to the United States is either U.S. or Canadian content. That's something that most people don't understand. This is a unique relationship that brings value to all the partners that we have. So, there's a lot of concern, understandably, about jobs. And a lot of the criticism has been, oh, Mexico's stealing our jobs. They outsmarted us in this negotiation, as you've heard, and we have to react to that. Well, the economic studies that have been done show that about 2 million jobs were lost in the first decade of this century to trade with China. And about 4.5 million jobs were lost because of new technology that increased the productivity in the United States but reduced the number of workers that were needed and raised the level of education or technical skill they had to have to complete those jobs. In fact, this year we reached the highest level of productivity in our manufacturing sector ever, and we had the lowest number of manufacturing jobs since the 1970s, which is when people really started measuring carefully these sectors. So it's not really Mexico here. In fact, the studies of NAFTA have shown that it's probably a wash in number of jobs. Jobs have moved to Mexico, but new jobs have been created in the United States at the same time. What has happened is lower skilled jobs have moved to Mexico, and the new jobs that have been created tend to be higher skilled jobs. Part of this shift, and you could see this with Canada too, is that foreign direct investment from the United States in Mexico has gone up significantly. $100 billion worth of investment there. But interestingly, in recent years, Mexican firms have started investing in the United States. So the Mexico you might have had in your mind of 20 years ago is really not the same Mexico. They now have world-class firms that can invest, compete successfully in the United States. 18,000 U.S. companies operate in Mexico. So not just selling in, they actually have plants there. Or, who do you think is the largest non-governmental employer in Mexico? Any guesses? Walmart is correct. They employ more Mexicans than any other private sector enterprise. At the same time in Mexico, there are some interesting things going on to introduce reform. Mexico is at the bottom of the list of OECD countries for educational quality, so they've introduced a massive reform of their education system. You may have read in the press that a number of the teachers are resisting this, out in the streets protesting and doing things. The irony is these teachers are from the poorest parts of the country, the places that have the worst education systems. We could talk about that if you want, but the government is pressing ahead with this education reform because they know it's important for the long run, even though it is really hard to do. They've introduced competition in their telecommunications system. Carlos Slim's companies used to dominate the Mexican system. With the new law, AT&T has invested $4.5 billion to set up a network that covers the United States and Mexico together and has already lowered prices significantly in Mexico, about 40% in some cases. The energy sector is denationalizing. It's now open to competition, both from Mexican private sector companies and international companies. It did so happen that as they introduced this reform, the prices dropped out of the market. So they've been having a tough time, but there's still a lot of investment, a lot of opportunity. And they believe as prices stabilize and come back, there'll be a lot to gain from having the private sector involved in exploiting their energy resources. It's not just in drilling holes for oil either. It's in electricity, it's in geothermal, it's in transmission, it's everywhere upstream and downstream that's being liberalized. Finally, in judicial and law enforcement, they're introducing a system closer to our own. Up until now, they've had a Napoleonic-based system where everything was done in writing. Now they're moving to a system where you actually have hearings and you have the two sides presenting before a judge. That's a massive change. If you just think they have to re-educate all their judges, all their lawyers, all their prosecutors, all their police who now have to actually come into court and present evidence, which they never had to do before. Along with all of this, in the last few years, we have built an unprecedented set of ways to talk to each other and to find solutions to problems, to identify opportunities. This you do not need to memorize, but it's just to give you an idea. We set up a high-level economic dialogue chaired at the top by our vice president and by Mexico's finance minister. We identified about 60 items to work on. And this gives you an idea of the span of what we're working on and what we've started doing. What you all might profit from is we now have a civil aviation agreement that allows many more flights at lower prices, so you can go back and forth, and so can Mexicans fly here. But it's across all sorts of areas of making the border more efficient, of having educational exchanges, of helping their students be able to work in English, of having researchers and scientists working together, of allowing a venture capital market in Mexico, which didn't exist when I went there 5 years ago now, but now it does. And some of this cooperation is with Canada, and particularly in the climate area. You can see a list of the things where we're working together with the three countries. That is really a whole new frontier, and part of this is made possible by the change of government in Canada. The Mexicans were always ready to do this. The change in Canada made this new cooperation possible. The border, another key area of cooperation. You can just see, I have this on here so you can see all the places that people and goods cross. It is a really complex place, and it was a place of a lot of tensions. So what we've been doing over the past 5 years is finding ways to actually work together with the goal of co-managing the border, preserving everybody's sovereignty, but actually working to identifying the problems and working together so you can make it easier to deal with those problems, and you can speed up the legitimate people and goods crossing that border. One of the things that you might profit from, does anybody have global entry here? Okay, well, global entry, well, pretty soon, by the end of the year, you should be able to go into any of the 3 countries with your global entry. The idea is that pre-vetted travelers from the 3 countries should be able to have facilitated entry and exit. The same thing for pre-vetted shippers. So you reduce the risk by identifying the people who you have confidence in, and then you can focus on the real risks. So that's part of the kind of work that's going on. A lot of talk about building walls. Not surprisingly, the Mexicans don't think the wall makes much sense. But the Dallas Morning News and a couple of others did a poll along in communities all on the border. And so you would think if somebody would want a wall, it might be the people living along the border. Well, you can see here 2/3 of the Americans said you definitely should not build a wall. So those concerned about the wall, as is often the case, are those who don't live anywhere near where the wall would be. The ones who live along there recognize there are problems, and we'll talk about those problems, but they don't think the wall is anywhere like the right solution to solving those problems. This gets us to immigrants. The debate going on is really about something that was happening 10 years ago. You can see here lowest level since the 1990s of immigrants headed north. This shows the net flow of immigrants in these 5-year periods. Clearly a lot coming to the United States in the 1990s, about even from 5 to 10, and then more leaving than coming. In fact, the Pew Center just did a study and finds that there are 1.1 million less Mexicans illegally in the United States than there were in 2007. So the debate that you've been hearing isn't reflecting what the real situation is right now. This shows the number of apprehensions. During this period of time, the number of Border Patrol have been multiplied, and still they found less and less Mexicans coming in. We conclude because there are less and less Mexicans coming in. And this little upswing at the bottom are Central Americans who have, for other reasons, are headed north because of the violence in their own countries, are seeking a solution by heading north. And this is where you had all the mothers and kids and young people coming in a couple of years ago. So there are serious challenges that need to be addressed. In the United States, drug demand is up, and the cartels, being good illegal businessmen, are responding to that. And they, as you see, the trends in use in the United States, the trends in production in Mexico follow that. We have to deal with that. Terrorism is a potential concern. Fortunately, it is potential. There have not actually been any terrorists found, but both governments are aware of it because they know if something did happen, it would be a really important event for bilateral relations. So there's close collaboration. Corruption remains a problem. When you make $19 billion a year selling drugs in the United States, you have a lot of money to corrupt people. And people get corrupted on both sides of the border. There is a lot of corruption, I would say more in Mexico, that needs to be dealt with, but it happens both places. Justice and law enforcement institutions, especially in Mexico, need to be strengthened. They need to be more effective. There needs to be more of a sense you can get justice more quickly. Social inequality and poverty in Mexico is still a problem, especially in the south and the west of that country. The benefits of NAFTA really helped the north and the center of Mexico a lot, but there's still much to do. Illegal immigration is still a problem, and is now a problem for both countries because those Central Americans are coming up through Mexico. And finally, the criminal networks are effective. They don't just deal in drugs. They buy arms in the United States, send them down south. They will traffic in people. They'll traffic in anything they can make money doing. And they have been really hard to get a handle on in both countries. I always just reiterate that it's not that the drugs come up and they hop over the border and then they just sit there. Somehow they move from the U.S. side of the border to the communities around the country where they harm our children and our neighbors and others. So these criminal networks work on both sides of the border. One of the responses that we've been trying to work on in the criminal and justice area, we've called the Mérida Initiative. It was actually set up by President Bush with President Calderon of Mexico. It's been working since. It's focused on these 4 areas. And we have about $2 billion that we've put into these programs. The Mexicans have spent about 12 times that much in these same programs over the past years trying to tackle these problems. So in addition to the Mérida Initiative, we have a dialogue with the Mexican Armed Forces. The Armed Forces, as you probably know, in Mexico have been called in to help the police because the police can't handle this. So we now have the best dialogue we've ever had with the Mexican Defense Forces. For many years, we were the prime enemy that they learned about as they were being trained to be officers and other things because no one else ever invaded them and took half their country, only the United States. We're now working to change that and actually working together on a whole bunch of different areas. And then finally, we have a bilateral security coordination group for the first time ever in the history of the 2 countries where all the different agencies sit down and talk about the range of challenges that we both face and we face together. I have this up here because it really shows the most pressing crisis between the two, not between the countries, but really in the United States. It's opioid overdose that, as I understand, started with overprescriptions of opioids in the United States, overuse of it. You can see the upswing in deaths, 4 times as many deaths since 2000 now. But being pretty effective capitalists, if illegal, the cartels saw this happening, started producing more opium and heroin in Mexico, and started now producing synthetic opioids to send to the United States and feed the market. Positive trends. This reform of the justice system in Mexico is really important and has the promise of making a much more effective and trustworthy justice system. Mexican Congress recently passed anti-corruption legislation, which could work if it's well implemented. They passed it because civil society people demanded that they passed it. They tried to water it down at first, and the reaction from the Mexican public was so negative they changed it and put it into effect. And in fact, the most encouraging step is that Mexico's population is no longer accepting lower standards. They're demanding more and more from their leadership in all the areas, including corruption. So we have a lot to do still in this relationship. We have to work in the law enforcement and fighting crime area. Mexico needs to work on reducing its poverty. And its main solution to doing that is to try and spread the benefits of manufacturing and trade and education. And we in the United States, we have to sort out what we want to do on immigration reform, and we really have to sort out what we think about trade. This new relationship with Mexico that has brought a lot of prosperity to Mexico, no question, has also brought benefit to the United States. But we need to work this through as a body politic and figure out what we think about it. So, bottom line, in my estimation, it's much better to have a more prosperous and cooperative neighbor than one that is poor, that is divided, that is not as effective as it might be, that we've produced a lot of complementary success for both economies in this relationship. It's allowed us to compete more effectively with China and others in the world, that we have a lot of possibility to transform the border so it can be both more secure and more efficient. And the net result should be more security for both countries. So I'm happy to take any of your questions, talk about whatever you might like to talk about. Please.
Very interesting. Why is the story not being better communicated by your side?
I said, no.
It's very fact-based, right? There's not a lot of subjective content there.
Well, I've been trying. I've written 10 different articles over this past year and tried to get them out there. And it's really interesting. The few times that when I've been on television and other things, they're not too excited about it because I don't get emotional and engage with people. I'm just trying to deliver the facts. It is hard to get people to want to pay attention to the facts. That's all I can say. I don't know. It puzzles me also. Please.
Yeah, thank you as well. From the Mexican side, from the at least 20 years into this, with what they've seen, with what's happening, or are they disappointed in certain aspects of it?
Well, there's certain things that haven't really worked in NAFTA as well as they would have liked. The trucking agreement, for example, they think their truckers should just be able to drive up to the United States and drive back, and that they would be as safe as American truckers. But overall, they are quite pleased with NAFTA and with the integration that it's brought about. It has created new middle class and lower middle class jobs in Mexico. But again, I don't see that as a negative. I see it as a good thing. If you step back and look at the United States from a strategic perspective, it's much better that we have two neighbors that are prosperous, that want to work with us, than a different situation. And in so many ways, we're really blessed where we are geostrategically in the world compared to the neighbors a lot of countries have. Please.
From my perspective, the most important component that we discussed today has to do with the reform of the legal system. I don't suppose you have a crystal ball. I'd love to know, how long does that take?
Well, you think about, are you a lawyer?
No, I love the law. I'm not a lawyer.
Think about retraining all your lawyers. How long is that going to take? Think about the policemen who've never had to come in and present evidence and be questioned in court. They now have to learn how to do that. It's going to take a few years, for sure.
So the story you present today, that transpired over how many years?
NAFTA is 20 years.
Thank you.
I think in general, having worked in Afghanistan and a lot of places, you need to think it takes a while to change people's mentality and people's practices. Some of us, as humans, change really quickly. A lot of us take a long time to change. But this transformation in Mexico, if you think about it in that sense, is really pretty amazing. Please.
Does Mexico have a vibrant press?
It does. Much more vibrant than the United States. If you go to Mexico City, you have 7 or 8 papers to read every morning that you can choose different things from. Now, there's some weaknesses in that system too. But they do, especially in Mexico City, they have a vibrant press. When you get out to some of the places where the cartels are more dominant, the press is not free because they're intimidated. And, you know, that's the reality.
That would slow down the judicial reform process as well.
It will make it hard in certain areas. So you have some areas that are just amazing in the modernity and the change, and you have other areas that aren't. And in different sectors, you'll see mixes. So it's not uniform everywhere. There's still a lot to do, but there is good going on. At the same time, there are problems to be dealt with. Please.
Hi, rather than ask you about the American political system, ask about the Mexican one, the Mexican democracy. How's that evolved in recent years? I mean, I think back it used to be, always democracy was very much one party dominating.
Right.
How's that evolved in recent years?
Well, the big change took place in 2000 when President Fox from the opposition won, and then Calderon was from PAN and he won. Peña Nieto came back, and people were really worried about that. But the big change has been just that people are more mobilized. They use social media in a way that we don't, to raise political questions and to organize among themselves and to question corruption and other stories in a way that's really pretty impressive. I mean, you've got 65 million Facebook users or something like that, and it's not just social interaction, it is political social interaction trying to bring about reform. And I think that's the biggest change, that's a positive change, is holding their leaders to a higher level of performance. Well, thank you very much. I think